Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to have you here. Welcome to Happy Texas Independence Day and the beginning of Women's History Month. We are delighted you are here for the Texas Science Festival session, which is called Deep in the Heart of Science, a peek into the science of what we love about the Lone Star State, where we are going to learn all about the science behind all things Texas. I am Katina McHenry. I have been a journalist, an entrepreneur, a storyteller, a podcast host in Texas for longer than I like to say. But as a moderator for today's session, I'm excited to welcome all of our brilliant and talented speakers, which you'll get to meet and hear from today. This is part of the festival's Science Sparks series, where each expert has 8 minutes to share some research and ideas that are quintessentially Texas topics and their research. Just a few housekeeping rules before I begin. We will talk about a couple things together. So you'll know your chat is disabled today. At the end, all 3 experts' presentations, we will turn to Q&A, and then you can submit your questions via the Q&A function. Today's talk is being recorded and will be shared on the College of Natural Sciences YouTube channel. So first, let's begin with our first presenter, David Hillis. He is the Alfred W. Rourke Centennial Professor of Biology at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's a director of UT's Biodiversity Center. Dr. Hillis is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a MacArthur Fellow, among many other awards. He is a recent published author. His book is available at UT Press, and it's called Armadillos and Sisyphus, a Naturalist in the Texas Hill Country, a collection of essays on the ecology, biodiversity, and restoration of the Texas Hill Country. He researches molecular evolution, phylogenetics, and systematics, including in longhorn cattle, which he breeds as the owner of the Double Helix Ranch. Welcome, David. You may now begin your presentation. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to spend the next 8 minutes talking about the spectacular biodiversity of the Texas Hill Country and why this region of Texas has such a wide diversity of plants, animals, and other organisms. This is a great topic for me to discuss, as I just wrote a book about it called Armadillos to Sisyphus, a Naturalist in the Texas Hill Country. And today I'll give you a quick glimpse into the subject, but if you want to know more, I hope that you might explore my essays in the book and learn more about the familiar and unfamiliar biodiversity of this region. People use the term hill country in several different ways, but I'm using it to mean the Edwards Plateau ecological region. This includes the geologic formation known as the Edwards Plateau, as well as the associated geologic regions it contains. And that geology of the plateau is the first major factor that results in the high biological diversity of the hill country. The map on the left here shows the Edwards Plateau in tan and surrounding and circling the Llano Uplift region in green. The geology of these 2 subregions could hardly be more different. The geologic map on the right shows the Cretaceous limestones in browns and greens, and which they formed as a seabed of a sea that covered central Texas for tens of millions of years, centered roughly about 100 million years ago. In the Llano Uplift, in the center of that region, those Cretaceous limestones have been eroded away, revealing much older granitic rocks that formed over 1 billion years ago when 2 early continents collided. Our Double Helix Ranch is located in that Llano Uplift region where I raise Texas longhorns and study their genetics and evolution. And we also work to understand and restore the biodiversity of the Edwards Plateau in this region and try to figure out how to restore animals while still operating a functional cattle ranch. In the limestone regions of the hill country, chalk outcrops degrade into alkaline soils, and enormous aquifers form in the limestone. That water is then released into springs, which form streams and then rivers, which in turn supply Texas with most of its fresh water. So most of the fresh water in Texas comes directly or indirectly from the Edwards Aquifer. In the Llano Uplift region, the older granitic rocks degrade into slightly acidic sandy soils, producing a very different landscape, and which favors many different species of plants and animals. These contrasting rock formations and soils are one of the factors that result in such biological diversity in the hill country. For example, there are isolated species of plants and animals that live in the Llano Uplift that occur nowhere else in the world, what biologists call endemic species. So this spectacular flower, for example, the one in the sort of the lighter shade of purple, kind of a lavender color, is the Llano Uplift sand mint, known by the scientific name of Brazoria inquistii. And amazingly, this beautiful flower was not formally described by biologists until just 20 years ago in 2003. Some of the specimens used to describe the species came from our Double Helix Ranch, from our biodiversity surveys there. People are often surprised to learn that biologists are still discovering new species of plants and animals, even in places that are as well known as the Texas Hill Country. Now, this map shows the tree cover across the United States in green, and it explains another factor that makes the hill country so biodiverse. The wooded Edwards Plateau is easily visible on this map on the western end of the extensive eastern forest. Many eastern and northern species have the western limits of their range here in the hill country. At the same time, there are also often relatives of Rocky Mountain and western species that occur in our region, overlapping with the eastern species. The open oak juniper woodlands of the plateau typically have interspersed grasslands and rocky outcrops. So there's also an overlap of grassland and desert species from the north and west that live across the region. This is a view of hill country woodlands in early winter, when our live oaks and junipers are still green and the Spanish oaks turn a beautiful red, giving a colorful contrast to the landscape. At the same time, the open nature of the woodlands allows many grassland and desert species to thrive as well. Now, to our south, we have the Sierra Madre Oriental of Mexico and connects to the hills of the Edwards Plateau. So many montane species range through the Sierra Madre north into Texas under the Edwards Plateau. So the hill country is a mixing area for species from eastern forests, western deserts and mountains, the Great Plains to the north, and the Sierra Madre to the south. To add all these geographic features, the Edwards and Trinity aquifers, shown here in green, lie beneath the Edwards Plateau. And so it's no accident that Austin, San Antonio, and many smaller Texas cities were founded along the eastern and southern borders of the Edwards Plateau, where giant springs from those aquifers deliver clean, fresh water to the surface. Those springs support a large number of endemic aquatic species that are found here and nowhere else in the world. As a result, we have many endemic fishes, amphibians, mollusks, insects, crustaceans, and aquatic plants that are uniquely Texan. And that diversity extends below the surface as well, down deep into the aquifers. Here, in the absence of light, there's a world where eyeless, catfishes, and salamanders are at the top of a complex and diverse food web. This is the beautiful Austin blind salamander, which is amazingly also just discovered and named within the last 20 years, even though it lives right here beneath the capital city of Texas. The Edwards Aquifer also forms beautiful and sometimes enormous caves, and some of those caves are home to some of the largest bat colonies in the world. The bat colonies of the Edwards Plateau often have populations of bats in the millions. These bats play an extremely crucial and important role in controlling insect populations, especially of agricultural pests. In addition, they also provide many of the nutrients that drive the Edwards Aquifer ecosystem. The best opportunities for seeing bat flights in the hill country are also some of the very best in the world. All those springs that issue forth from the aquifers eventually form the rivers of the Texas Hill Country, each of which enter the Gulf of Mexico separately, which isolates their aquatic species across river basins, giving rise to yet more endemic species. The rivers of the Edwards Plateau were once famous for their freshwater mussels, whose shells were heavily exploited for the button industry. Before the advent of plastic buttons, clothing buttons were often made by drilling out mother of pearl circles from freshwater mussel shells and then drilling in holes for the threads. Today, our endemic mussels are in trouble, but careful observers can still see them in many places. They have a fascinating reproductive biology. For example, this genus is Lampsillus, and it extends this fish-like lure. That's not a fish. It looks a lot like a fish, but it's actually a mussel pretending to be a fish. And it's trying to attract a predatory fish like bass. It's using this like a lure. Now, why in the world would a mussel want to do that? Well, when the bass comes to try to eat this lure, the mussel expels thousands of its young, which then clamp onto the gills of the bass and parasitize it. The tiny mussels then grow and move on the host fish and drop off and develop as new adults. So the bass gives them both transportation as well as nutrition. Well, as we move on into the spring wildflower season, many people will enjoy the spectacular displays of wildflowers that we have across the Hill Country. If you go visit them, I hope that you'll stop and consider the reasons that the Texas Hill Country is such a beautiful and diverse place. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. I learned so much. I hope you guys did too. Our next presenter is an amazing friend and former colleague, Andrea DeLong Amaya. She is the Director of Horticulture at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. She oversees gardens and nursery programs for the official Botanic Garden of Texas. She has 25 plus years of experience with native plants in horticulture, ecology, and garden design. She is a contributing writer to Taunton's Fine Gardening, Rodell's Organic Gardening, Public Garden, and Neil Sperry's Gardens magazine. Welcome, Andrea.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Those are the things that the cows don't want to eat, like mesquite and prickly pears and things like that. I have another slide here, but it's not exactly what I want you to conjure up in your mind. Let's see, I'm trying to advance my slide there. There we go. So I want you to just indulge me and close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you have a longhorn bull standing in front of a barbed wire fence. Maybe it's under the light shade of a mesquite tree, because as I said, they don't like to eat them. And maybe there's some prickly pear in the foreground. And then beyond to the horizon is just a deep ocean of bluebonnets. Cattle don't like to eat bluebonnets either. This is an iconic image that's worthy of a "Howdy You from Texas" kind of postcard. And then they avoid, for the most part, the woody plants, the herbs, the herbaceous plants, and then the bluebonnets. They're the most unpalatable species, and ranchers and ecologists call these unpalatable plants increasers because they increase under cattle grazing. Bluebonnets are weeds. So what is a weed? There's not a definition of weeds. Often we'll say that a weed is simply a plant that's growing where it's not wanted, and that's the horticulturist in me talking. From an ecological perspective, a weed is often thought of as a plant that quickly colonizes
We're so sorry, everybody. We are obviously experiencing some technical difficulties right now. If you'll, okay, it looks like we have Andrea back, and we will try this again.
You may have to start again, Andrea. Your signal is really spotty.
Yeah. Are you seeing that now?
Yes, we're seeing it now.
Okay. My apologies for that.
It's okay.
Okay, what is a weed? I was talking about that a strategy of annuals is often that they only live one season. They do their business very quickly. They bloom, they set their seed, and then they die. And bluebonnets are annuals, so they do all of that stuff in a very short amount of time, and then they drop seed for the next generation. Then once they've done that, their job of replacing and increasing themselves, they wither away. Now, this picture, and then in the spring, they bloom and they show you so familiar cobalt colored blossom. Here she is coming in for the landing, and say she, because the majority of the bees you see flying around are females. In the spring, after they've done their blooming, they'll start to set seed, and sometimes they can look a little unsightly as they're maturing or going to seed. But if you're growing them and you want them to return year after year, you'll have to let them ripen and drop on the ground for the next season's crop. And it's okay to mow them or pull them up once the seeds have matured and turned brown, like you see in the picture here. And then that's usually around mid-May, depending on the year. And incidentally, bluebonnets are in the pea or the legume family. And the picture on the left, you can see that resemblance. I also think it's very interesting that in the middle of the summer, the whole of the species exists only in the form of seeds. So there are virtually no plants that are happening in July. So far we've been talking about the Texas bluebonnet, Lupinus texensis, and that's the scientific or the botanical name. And we recognize this as a state flower of Texas, which grows in all corners of the state, all throughout the state. But there are actually several different species that are in the genus Lupinus, and we can appreciate all of them as our state flower. And here's another little aside. As you see this image, here's testing your knowledge. Do you know who's standing in this field of Texas bluebonnets? The woman you're looking at was born Claudia Alta Taylor, and she later became known as Lady Bird Johnson, or the spouse of Lyndon Baines Johnson, our president. And she was a pioneering environmentalist before the term was even commonly used. And of course, she's the namesake of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. Another bluebonnet species, Lupinus subcarnosus, is the sandyland bluebonnet, which is what you see in this picture. They're very similar to the Texas bluebonnets. The sandyland bluebonnets, as you can imagine, grow in sandy soils, mostly in south and eastern part of the state. And to tell them apart, you can have them side by side. The image on the left is our Texas bluebonnet with the white tips. And then the sandyland bluebonnet on the right, which has more of that sapphire blue and not the white tips. So that's how you can tell those two apart. Both of those are annual species. Now, if you are a fan of the Big Bend region, you have probably appreciated this beautiful bluebonnet. This is Lupinus havardii, and this is the Big Bend bluebonnet. And these are spectacular plants that get 2 to 3 feet tall. They're stunning. And here you have an image in front of the iconic mule ears in the national park. So this time of year, the bluebonnets are starting to happen. You're seeing them on the roadsides. And so a few things to note if you're wanting to appreciate those flowers as you're out and about. The first thing I'd warn is to please be respectful. Don't crush everything as you're wandering around and enjoying those bluebonnets. Leave as many intact as possible for the next folks coming along, and also for the wildlife, the bees that are collecting that pollen and pollinating the plants. It's also important to be aware of fire ants and chiggers as the season gets a little bit warmer. Look out for snakes and the like. It's also really important to avoid those high traffic roads, the highways and stuff. So maybe you're finding a neighborhood or a park. Brenham has and other areas of the state have wildflower driving maps that you can take, and they'll take you on back roads, which might be a little bit calmer and not, I-35. And then, of course, you can come visit us at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. We have a whole lot of things to see here, not just bluebonnets. This time of year is very exciting. We have every day there's something new to see. We have right now and the giant spiderworts and the golden eyes. And it's also helpful to know that as staff or faculty and students, you get free admission here at the Wildflower Center. And then just a little plug, if you're interested in growing some of these on your own, you can visit us at our plant sale that's coming up at the end of March, and it'll be running for 9 weekends throughout the spring. And you can find out more information on our website. And please come visit us. If you're curious about growing, we have a section of our website, including how to grow bluebonnets. And that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. If you missed any part of the last part of her presentation, the Wildflower Center is probably the safest place to take your bluebonnet photos. There's a huge bluebonnet patch that's going to be there this spring. Thank you, Andrea. Our next presenter is Drew Hayes. She is an associate professor of instruction in the Department of Nutritional Science. She is also a registered dietitian and professionally trained chef. We're going to be friends because I don't know how to cook, so we need to hang out a little bit more, Drew. She received her BS and her MA at UT Austin. Her academic interests are food science, clinical adult nutrition, critical care, food, and cooking. Welcome, Drew.
Thank you, Katina. Thank you for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here today. Texas is, as we know, an amazing place, and it has so many delicious foods that we could talk about and discuss, such as barbecue or Texas margaritas or maybe some tacos. But I thought, what a great way to celebrate Texas than to really discuss the pecan. So the pecan tree is the Texas state tree. So just a little bit about pecans, a little background. From a Texas historical perspective, pecan groves are really important to indigenous peoples of Texas. And so places where you see pecan groves grow indicate that indigenous populations inhabited that area in the past, because pecans were actually a important source of nutrition for those people. So in terms of nutrition, which is my area of expertise, pecans are an excellent source of heart healthy fats. They actually have more fats than most nuts, and so we're getting a good dose of healthy fat from them. 1 ounce of pecans, which is about 20 halves, that will give you about 10% of the daily value of recommended fiber, which is a nutrient that's often lacking in the typical American diet, and it's really important for gut health and nutritional health. And pecans also contain a huge variety of bioactive compounds, which have been associated with decreasing low density lipoprotein cholesterol, so LDL cholesterol, and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. So I think we can say that pecans are a heart healthy option, and they have a lot to offer. So I thought I'd show you 2 simple ways to use pecans, and you don't even need a lot of additional ingredients. So the first thing that we're going to look at is how to make pecan butter. And so this is actually a really awesome alternative to peanut butter. And so using a celebrated Texas ingredient. So what I've done is I've toasted some pecans here on my sheet pan. And these pecans, I did about 6 minutes total, just to give them a little bit of toast. And a tip for when you're making a nut butter like this is to use hot nuts, because the fats that are within the nuts, they'll be more fluid when the temperature is hot. And so that helps us blend them up together. And so I'll just put these in my food processor and blend away. Okay, so to make good use of our time, I'll show you where we're at right here. But you can see we're getting to kind of a dusty type mixture, so not close to pecan butter yet. So I'll need to run this food processor with the warm pecans for about 4 to 5 minutes to get them to be nice and smooth. And so what we'll turn out with, or what we end up with, is a product like this. And this is just pecans that I've roasted and whizzed in that food processor for a few minutes. And so with this product, I recommend using a little bit of salt, makes it taste nice, and a little bit of liquid sweetener, just a touch of maple syrup, agave nectar, honey, something like that, to give it a little bit of sweetness. And the reason I'm recommending a liquid sweetener is just because it mixes into the pecan butter easier than a granulated sugar. So again, all together, really quick, short recipe, and something that you can do with kids. It's, I think, fun to see how products like that are made. It's so easy. So kind of switching gears a little bit, the second product that I wanted to show y'all how to produce with pecans is pecan milk. And so maybe you're in with the alternative milk craze. These are really popular products right now, and people are looking for alternatives to cow's milk. In this case, this is a way to make use of local ingredients. So our pecans that are readily available at HEB or maybe in the pecan tree in your backyard, like I have. So here I have these pecan halves, and I used about 8 ounces of pecan halves here in my blender and about 1,200 mils or 5 cups ish of water. Soaked it overnight, and that's all. So pecans and water. And I have a good high-powered commercial blender, and I'll blend this up for a second. So please excuse the noise. So as you can see, I got a little ambitious with the volumes and overflowed my blender a little bit. But the good news is this is still totally salvageable, no big deal. And so I would want to run this blender for, again, maybe 3 to 4 minutes, get this nice and homogeneous. And then the next step is to take the top off like this. And I have a here strainer that is lined with some cheesecloth, and I will pour the contents of my blender in here. And again, I will have normally blended it for a little longer and just let the liquid come out so you can see out of the bottom of the strainer. So that is pecan milk. And to show you what it looks like all said and done, I have the finished product right here. And so you can see it kind of has that nutty brown coloring from pecans. Nice flavor. Again, I recommend a tiny bit of salt and a little bit of sweetener just to get that nice flavor going on, and you're ready to go. And so with this product, it's going to have a little less protein than cow's milk per se. And so I think it's nice for coffee and with your morning cereal or your overnight oats, products like that. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one swap for regular cow's milk when we're cooking and baking with it, because it has different functional properties. Both of these are good if you add a splash of vanilla extract as well. So again, super, super easy. We got a little mess to clean up, but we're fine. And so the last thing I'll mention is the leftover shell, or the outer portions of the pecan that we blended and strained. You can spread that out on a sheet pan or in a food dehydrator and dehydrate it or in a very low oven. And that is pecan flour. And so that can be used as a replacement for some proportion of wheat flour in recipes. So I think that's everything for our pecan demonstration.
Thank you so much, Drew. That was a cool glimpse into a short little cooking show. I love it. We now begin the Q&A portion of our session today. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If your questions are for one of the specific presenters, make sure you acknowledge that as well. So we'll begin with some questions. And so far we have questions for each person on the panel. If you will, panelists, keep your answers short so we can get as many questions in as we possibly can. The first question is for David. What are some of the best things we can do as society to protect the unique and rare species of the Texas Hill Country from threats like climate change, pollution, and urban development?
Okay, well, this is a great discussion. It's probably a longer discussion than we have for right now, since each of those different topics could go on for quite a while, but I'll just mention a couple of quick things. The main things that we need to do as a society in protecting not just the hill country and the species here, but really the whole planet from climate change is reduction of fossil fuels. And so, the biggest uses of fossil fuels are in electricity generation and in transportation. And those are two things that we have solutions for. So right now we run our ranch entirely on solar power. And in fact, we have net metering. So we sell our excess solar power back to the grid, back to the electric company. And so rather than writing checks to the electric company, they write us checks. And then we use that solar power to power all of our vehicles. We use electric. We have all electric cars and electric vehicles, which have come a long way in recent years. If you haven't tried an electric vehicle, you might be surprised at what wonderful experiences they are. So those are two simple things we can do for the climate change issue. Pollution, the biggest issue for pollution in the hill country is aquatic pollution. And we need to be really careful about what we dump into our Texas rivers and waterways and aquifers, because all that's the water that we need as humans, as well as all the other species needing it. So reducing aquatic pollution and watching about how we dispose of our wastewater is a critical matter there.
Thank you, David. Excuse me. Our next question is for Drew. What are your favorite Texas foods we can incorporate into our everyday cooking?
Oh, gosh. I think that, like I mentioned, Texas has a lot to offer as far as delicious foods. If it is occasionally, I am a Texas barbecue fan. And so, we can use our beef and, get really nice tender cuts of meat. In terms of native foods, there's a lot of interesting chefs are doing things with mesquite and mesquite flour, and so that's really cool if you're kind of trying to incorporate native foods into their diet. But things that grow well in my garden, tomatoes, basil, hot peppers, all of those things are excellent sources of nutrition. And anytime anyone's eating a fruit or a vegetable, it makes me as a dietitian happy.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is for Andrea. Andrea, participant asks, are there any native medicinal plants that are easy to grow in Austin?
Yeah, actually there are. One of my favorites is to grow the echinacea, the purple coneflower. Echinacea purpurea or Echinacea angustifolia is a little harder to find, although it grows, it's hard to find commercially, but it grows around here. Both do really well in garden settings, and you can use the seeds. You can also use the roots. I've had a lot of purple coneflower take over my yard, so I don't mind sacrificing a few, and you can take the roots and just kind of peel off the outside, put them in a little jar with some alcohol like Everclear, vodka will work, and let it sit for a while, and then you make your own tincture. And if you've ever gone to the natural food store and you buy the little tincture, it can be pretty expensive, and so you can make your own pretty easily. And echinacea is really good for boosting the immune system, so that's one easy one to do.
Awesome.
And it's a beautiful plant that's great for pollinators too.
Yeah. A little plug for the Wildflower Center. So the new Wildflower Center magazine that's coming out has a catalog of medicinal plants that grow here in Texas. So make sure you get a copy. And if you don't have a copy, make sure you become a member so you can get your copy. All right. And next question is for Drew. How can we make our favorite Texas foods and meals vegetarian or vegan friendly? Is there a way to adjust without compromising on flavor and taste?
Sure, definitely. There are all kinds of alternatives if you're looking for to remove animal products. My favorite go-to is beans and legumes. And so, actually beans are pretty common in a lot of Texas cuisine already, and they're an excellent source of carbohydrates, protein, fiber. So very much like a nutritional superstar that I think are really delicious. And so that would be my first go-to. And also I like soy products as well as alternatives to meats. And you can get creative with it. So if I don't know how we'll sub, say a grilled steak for a plant, but using those as well as swaps for ingredients actually works quite well in many cases. So I recommend beans and legumes.
Excellent. This question is for David from Gretchen. She asks, David, you are the perfect person to ask. I heard that the true pure longhorns are extinct. Are yours a DNA match to the old longhorns?
Yeah, so that we've done a lot of investigation of longhorn genomes to look at the many different stories that people have about the origins of longhorns. And longhorns have a very complex and interesting history. Cattle were domesticated twice about 10,000 years ago, and there are two major strains of cattle. One that became common in India and then was then transferred into Africa and tropical parts of Africa, and the other throughout Europe. And then when the Moors moved up from Africa into Southern Europe in the 8th century, they brought their cattle with them and mixed these two lineages. And then those mixed cattle were the ancestors that were taken by the Spanish and Portuguese out to the Canary Islands. And that's where on Columbus's second voyage, he picked up cattle in the Canary Islands and brought them to the New World. And those were the origins of the Texas Longhorns. And the cattle we have today fit all those patterns very nicely. They show the mixture of the two different strains. They're largely the European strains. They're about 85% from the European strains, and about 15% of their genome comes from the Indian strain. It's hard to say what people mean by pure longhorn, because the longhorns are themselves very diverse, and there've been obviously interbreeding with other breeds. But as near as we can tell, the genomes of most of the longhorns that are registered today are very similar to what we'd expect from those origins of cattle brought over from the Canary Islands in the 1400s.
Thank you, David, for answering that question. Our next question is for Drew, and this is from Jamie Neal. Do you have to clean pecan shells before making them into flour? What are the steps after you dry? Do you use the food processor? And how do you store without preservatives all of those pecan products?
That's several questions in one, and very good question about cleaning the pecans. And so pecans are a shell nut, which I didn't show. And so this is the shelled version here. And so if you have the whole pecan, you'll want to clean the shells first because they fall off the trees, they're in dirt. So you'll clean them then, and then you can do a secondary cleaning of the nuts themselves, and you'll want to spread them out and ensure that they dry so they don't grow molds or anything like that. And so once they're dry, then any of these products that I showed you, the best way to preserve them is I would recommend putting them in the freezer. So that's a really good method for preserving foods. And so pecans, because they're very high in fat, that fat oxidizes very quickly, and so it has a pretty short shelf life, and so freezing will help prolong the shelf life. And then if you were asking about, I think, making the pecan flour, and so since that is made from the blended pulp of the pecan nuts, it's already pulverized, and so you'll just spread it on a sheet pan or on your food dehydrator and dehydrate it at very low temperature. And once it's done, you'll be able to crumble it like flour, so it'll be nice and loose. So you won't necessarily have to add it back to a food processor or anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew. Our next question is for Andrea. The participant asked if you know if McKinney Falls usually has a lot of bluebonnets. Where is the best place to take bluebonnet pictures?
Well, I have not actually been to McKinney Falls already this year, but I drive on 71 right by McKinney Falls in that area, and the bluebonnets on the highway are looking great. And it's just the beginning of the season, so I'm looking forward to the next month or so, depending on how the weather holds out, which I think is supposed to be an average wet year. So that'll be good for keeping the flowers continuing to bloom. So I'm assuming that they're going to be pretty nice in McKinney Falls. But really any of the state parks would be great. National parks, if you can get to some of those, Central Texas. And as I mentioned, I think Brenham has a wildflower driving map, and there may be some other areas that have driving maps too. And of course, come to the Wildflower Center because we have areas set up specifically for photo spots for bluebonnet pictures.
Thank you, Andrea. This next question may be a two-part answer from both you and David. The question is, how can climate change and other weather factors like winter storms impact bluebonnets?
Yeah, we get that question a lot this year after the ice storm in particular this year. And the ice storm actually didn't get that cold. So it really didn't affect anything that was on the ground, any of the native plants that were on the ground. And bluebonnets in particular have that rosette and they stay tight to the ground. The ground actually had a lot of warmth in it and protected the leaves of those rosettes. But bluebonnets are really adapted to lots of cold weather in the wintertime and in the early spring. So that's not anything unusual from what they've seen in the past. The problem that we had with the ice storm most recently was the weight, and that was breaking the limbs off of trees and brittle plants. But the soft herbaceous plants like bluebonnets were just fine. Now, the cold weather that we had 2 years ago was interesting because the snow actually acted as an insulating blanket and protected the bluebonnets and other spring plants that were still low and short on the ground. And I did notice some of the foliage that had come above the snow. A little bit of the foliage, the tips got a little bit frozen, a little bit of frost damage, but sometimes that happens, but the plants just resprout from it. They can take pretty cold weather.
All right, David, this question is for you. What was the most interesting part of writing your new book? What are you hoping is the biggest takeaway from reading the essays?
Okay, great. Well, thanks for asking the question. I really wrote the book with thinking about people going out and enjoying the hill country and seeing things, but not necessarily knowing what all to look for or knowing what all that they were looking at. And so a lot of the chapters that I wrote are essays that talk about things that people probably have seen and maybe noticed a little bit, but then probably to provide some more in-depth and understanding about them so that they can gain a greater enjoyment of their hill country experience. And that's really what the essays are about, is learning to enjoy and interact with nature and see what a fabulous place we have here in Texas for biodiversity.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that's all we have, all the time we have for questions. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our participants.